on the government of Guam side, and he's with the Human Resources Group, SHRM. And so we wanted to bring him on and talk about vaccine mandates just generally, and then in the private sector as well. Good morning, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Chris. Good to see you.
This early in the morning? You sure about that?
Well, last time we talked like this, it was already 18 months ago.
Right, yeah, like that was crazy. Yeah, that was the
very beginning. Right.
Yeah. Mike, so I guess vaccine mandates, what can private companies do?
Well, I can understand the concern from the public and just everyone generally. You have a mandated shot in your arm, and that's going to obviously give you this feeling like your rights are being invaded, and I can definitely understand the concern about that. It's unusual that you would have some kind of a mandate like that. I mean, in this situation, we're in a very unusual time. But I think that in terms of whether an employer can require the vaccination, it's really, from a legal standpoint, it's not really a close call because of the conditions we're in, right? It's a workplace safety issue. And workplace safety is always the most important factor, when it comes to regulating the workplace, right? Obviously, you want everyone to be comfortable in the workplace, and there's issues about harassment and things like that, but there's nothing more important than workplace safety, actual physical safety. So employers, it's like when I said it's not a close call, it's from a legal standpoint, an employer has to create a safe workplace. And in this situation, there's, people disagree as to how dangerous COVID is, but just all the evidence that we've had over the past 18 months is that it is something that's potentially deadly. And an employer not only has a right to workplace safety, but an employer has an obligation to its employees and to the public to have a safe work environment. So it's not that all employees are necessarily going, not all employers are necessarily going to go as far as requiring that the vaccinations be given, but it is definitely allowed by law. And in anticipation of the concern, that there would be over this, even the federal agency that's in charge of enforcing anti-discrimination laws and making sure that employees are treated fairly and not, terminated for unjust reasons. That's the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They've even issued guidance in advance because they knew this was going to be a concern. That there is no civil rights violation if an employer mandates vaccines. And one of the reasons for that is that it's one thing if you're requiring employees to get vaccinated and saying that all employees, in other words, you're forcing someone to get a shot in their arm. The way that the courts and the EEOC look at this issue, it's not that you're required to get the vaccine. It's just that if you want to be in the workplace, you have to get vaccinated. So that it's not as though you don't have other alternatives. Obviously you can find another place to work. There's ways that you can try to, if employers are able to accommodate employees that have legitimate reasons for not getting vaccinated, employers have to do that. There's two particular categories of exemptions that employers have to allow for. One is if you have a disability or if you have some kind of physical condition that would prevent you or make it dangerous for you to be vaccinated. And that's pretty narrow. There's not too many, I don't think there's too many physical conditions that fall into that category. But under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that would be considered a disability. Somebody who has some sort of issue where they can't get vaccinated, the doctor is recommending that they don't because it's dangerous for them. They would then be considered disabled, and then the employer in that situation has to try to find an accommodation for that person, just as they would if they had any other disability. If an employer has a job where you have to be on your feet, greeting customers, for example, and then an employer has some issue and can't stand, then you'd have to try to accommodate that employee, find a way, if you can, if there's a way that you can accommodate the employee, if they can do it in a wheelchair, if they have some other assignment, you can put them in where you can still keep them employed and it doesn't disrupt your business. Doesn't have an undue burden on your business, you have to try to do that. So in the same way with an employee that for some physical reason can't get the vaccine, is there a way you can accommodate that employee? Can that employee work remotely? Is there another way that you can minimize the risk of harm to the public and still keep that employee employed? You have to try to do that. And the other category is not under the ADA, but it would be under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that's a religious accommodation. If an employee can't get vaccinated or doesn't want to get vaccinated for a legitimate, sincerely held religious belief, you then have to try to accommodate that employee in a similar way. Try to find a way that that employee can still work and not be at risk to the public.
Mike, what, sorry, but with this religious exemption, right, I was just wondering, like, what religions do you think that this would be applicable to? Because, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't, not really sure either. You know, in that one, it's obviously very sensitive because, you know, you're talking about religious beliefs, deeply held religious beliefs, which are obviously, you know, they're very sensitive, can have an emotional component.
Yeah.
But from an employer standpoint, you're not really allowed to make so much of a judgment call on that. I mean, if, you know, because it doesn't necessarily have to be an established religion, I guess what I'm saying. There can be it can be a religion that's not necessarily well known, and you can't really, you sort of have to take the employee at their word. If you have some independent basis to believe that the employee doesn't really hold a religious belief and that they're just kind of making it up, you have some other sort of factual basis for that, yeah, that can come into play. But otherwise, you can't do like some sort of background check, or you can't interrogate the person about their beliefs.
Right.
In most cases, you have to sort of accept it if they do, you know, put forth that explanation, and then try to accommodate them. That doesn't mean you have to accommodate them, because in some workplaces, you know, there's just nothing you can do. They have to be there in person. They're putting people at risk for not being vaccinated. So you have to at least go through an analysis and make an attempt to see whether there's some arrangement that can be made for them in that situation.
Mike, in the EEOC guidance, does it specify that when a private company implements a mandatory COVID vaccine program, that the vaccine has to be fully approved by the FDA, or emergency use authorization is fine? Because we just read a story on this bill that's been introduced in the legislature to kind of prevent this mandatory vaccination executive order that the governor had issued, that the vaccine has to be fully approved by the FDA first. And then we kind of heard with the Department of Defense, Lloyd Austin is sent a memo that he wants to implement a mandatory vaccine program within the military, and you know, the president, he can waive the EAU or the FDA when they give full approval. You know, that's when he's hoping to get the mandatory vaccine program in place. So I wasn't sure if that EEOC guidance kind of clarified that.
Yeah, we did have a question about that. What about the vaccine status as only being emergency use approved? Do all the things you said still apply, or is that more for FDA approved vaccines and whatnot?
Yeah, so the EEOC guidance doesn't distinguish between the two, and it came out in May, right? It came out long before there was any sort of target date, I think, for full FDA approval. So it contemplates existing approval, the emergency use approval, and it doesn't really distinguish and doesn't really give an analysis of the distinction. But it came out at a time when that was the only approval, was emergency use, and what it says is that right now, the current status of the approval, it can be mandated, and it doesn't constitute any sort of civil rights issue as long as you accommodate those two exempt categories that I mentioned.
So it looks like for the employees who may not want to get vaccinated, that their out would be the religious argument, unless they come with some kind of, oh, I'm a member of the church and we hate vaccines. Yep, it's against my religion. If it's something like that, something that just seems on its surface kind of ridiculous, then the employer could maybe raise a question. But other than that, if you just say it's against my religious beliefs, that acts as, what, some kind of shield?
It does, but like I said, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the analysis. Then you have to look to see whether you can reasonably accommodate the employee, and that's often not possible.
Right.
You know, I mean, if it is possible, it's fine. I don't really anticipate that this is going to be a huge problem for most employers in Guam, because unlike the States, here most people are vaccinated, and a lot of employers who would decide to implement a mandatory policy, most of their workforce, most employers in those industries are probably have almost fully vaccinated employee workforces to begin with. So there may be here and there some issues with it, but it doesn't seem to me that in Guam, at least, it's going to be a major issue.
Right. I mean, we're already approaching 90% vaccination of the adult population. I mean, how many other people are left? Right, is what you're saying.
Yeah. One thing I would add to that, though, is that one thing that's important is that even if we can rely on the EEOC, and they say that mandating this requiring a vaccine does not create a civil rights issue. If you cannot employ the person, the EEOC says that that's not, in other words, the employee has to find another job and can't work there anymore. That does not constitute wrongful termination if the reason is that they're not getting vaccinated, so you can't let them in the workplace. But when you implement this policy, it's really important that employers do it fairly. In other words, so if you have a workforce where you anticipate there's going to be a decent number of employees that might opt to not get vaccinated, you have to implement it in a neutral way. In other words, let's say half of your workforce now doesn't come to work because they have a problem with the vaccination. Now you only have half of the staff that you thought you would have. Now you're sort of in a position where you're understaffed, and now you might be tempted to make exceptions. Like, well, shoot, these managers, I really need these guys. Okay, I'll make an exception for you guys. You guys can come in without the vaccination. You create some sort of exception. In that case, now you're opening up a different issue. Now you're opening a possible discrimination claim, saying, well, why am I being treated unfairly? Is it because I'm older, or is it because my ethnicity? Then you're opening up all that. So, I mean, you have to be careful when you implement the policy. You should have it in writing, make sure it's clearly, it's applied across the board. And the only exceptions are those two that are required under EEOC guidelines. And so that you don't end up inadvertently walking into a discrimination claim just in the way that you implemented it.
Right. I just wanted to ask before we let you go. I know we're talking private sector here, right? And I know Bree had mentioned the government of Guam mandate. Do you feel that these it's like cookie cutter? You can just apply the same things you told us to the government, or does it kind of change because it's the public sector?
Well, it's more a little bit more complicated analysis when it's the government doing this, because civil rights are more of an issue. The main thing about the constitutional rights is that the state is not supposed to take action against you that violates your rights, right? So when the government's doing it, there's a little bit a heightened level of scrutiny on that action. And so then you're looking not so much at the EEOC, but you're looking at the courts, and you're looking at the Constitution to see whether the government is allowed to do this. And the civil rights analysis becomes a little bit more detailed in that context, right? But even there, as I said in the beginning, it's really not a close call. There's U.S. Supreme Court cases going back. The reason why they're so old, you look at these cases, the Supreme Court cases from the early 1900s, is because back then there was an issue like this. It was smallpox was spreading across the country, and states were starting to implement mandatory vaccine laws. That everybody's got to get vaccinated, and and so that went to court, and so back as long ago as 1905, there's a U.S. Supreme Court case that says when a state does that in a situation where there's a public emergency, it's a pandemic or an epidemic, the state is allowed to do it. It does violate your liberty to have, it's considered an unwanted medical procedure. If you don't want to be vaccinated, you're getting a shot in your arm. It's medical treatment that you don't want, right? And so that is a violation of your liberty, and it is a constitutional issue. But the analysis is there a compelling interest? Is there a basis for the public benefit? Is there an issue that warrants it? Yeah. And so you do this sort of balancing test, and the courts that have looked at that have decided that in the situation when you're in a pandemic, that it outweighs the infringement on your civil rights to require it. So that would be more of an analysis of case law, and that's I think why in the governor's executive order you see the cases that they reference. I think that they're anticipating potential concern. And I think it seems like they've tried to make all the arguments in the executive order, and those are the arguments that you find in the case law when you do the analysis, including a couple of recent cases where this same argument has been made in a few district courts, U.S. district courts in the states.
Mike, I wonder if it gets fuzzy, right? Because when you talk about the community, the intent to protect the community, I wonder if it got deep into a court case on the government side. If someone could argue that, oh well, if I'm vaccinated, I can still catch COVID, so how is this protecting the community? You know what I mean? I feel like there are arguments that could be made on the government side, right? I mean, we're just getting comments along those lines.
Yeah, and when you read the cases, you see that the way the courts look at it, they're also relying on science. So they understand, general understanding is that vaccination doesn't just protect the person. The whole point is to eradicate the pandemic, eradicate whatever the virus is, right? And the only way to do that is to get most people vaccinated. In fact, you have to get way more than the majority. You have to get 80% to get to the point where now the virus will no longer spread. And so in order to do that, everyone has to get vaccinated. And if you're looking at it from the standpoint of an individual, you're not just trying to protect that person. You're trying to create this sort of vaccinated community. Because that's the goal. Assuming that's the goal, and the courts sort of accept that as a premise that that's what we're trying to achieve. Okay, well then that is a pretty important thing to get this thing eradicated. And it's important enough so that if a person is now required to comply with it, they also look to see how big of an infringement is this on the person. They're not being locked up. They're just being told they've got to get this shot. And that's, that is outweighed by this sort of huge public benefit of creating an eradication of a virus.
Interesting. You good, Bree?
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of ask, within the organization, SHRM, and the human resources managers, is that kind of what we're going to be seeing, or that's kind of the big topic of discussion amongst the human resource managers, that they're kind of looking to implement a mandatory vaccine program in their companies?
Yeah, it has been more recently, over the past month or so, a topic that has come up. The SHRM, members of SHRM are mostly HR professionals, HR managers from different companies, and there's a community of HR managers. It's everyone knows each other, and so they kind of sort of bounce things off each other. If they have a policy and the way they do it in their workplace, they'll sort of share that with other HR managers from other industries to sort of get, so that everyone's kind of on the same page, and everyone's also, if they've got some good innovation and a good way that it's been rolled out and worked well, then they'll help each other. But it's definitely a lot more lately. I mean, a few months ago, we were talking about mostly just encouraging employees and ways to incentivize employees to get vaccinated, making it easy for them, paying for their time off, give them paid leave to do it, making sure that there's plenty of opportunity, telling them how it can be done. So more of just, or even giving them some extra sort of prize if they get vaccinated, right?
Like a new car?
But now it's more, people are starting to realize now that we really need to get this mandated, and I think a lot of companies are now starting to look in that direction.
Mike, I don't know if you can speak on this, but I think the evolution of the mandatory vaccinations for government and private sector workers is this thing that you're seeing in the States now, where it's you can only come in here if you're vaccinated. You can only shop here if you're vaccinated. You can only get a coffee here if you're fully vaccinated. Do you think we're going to see that type of thing on Guam, and does it hold up legally?
Well, it holds up legally. I think I think it's it's the same kind of situation. You're talking about a safe work environment. It's we're in employment context, it's about protecting employees and the public, but even in any sort of public setting, restaurants, those are still a workplace. And so if you're requiring your employees to be vaccinated, you can also require customers to be vaccinated, or anyone who enters that space to be vaccinated. In the States, you're seeing universities that are requiring not only their students, but all the support staff, faculty, everyone that works in the cafeteria, and anyone coming onto the campus has to be vaccinated. And that's some schools are starting to implement that, but it's a very similar type of analysis as the EEOC analysis, and that the workplace safety, or just the safety of any sort of public environment, especially in enclosed space, it outweighs the sort of the infringement on liberties that people are concerned with.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Yeah,
that
Mike,
was a lot of good
that was really
information.
interesting. I thought we were going to fall asleep when they mentioned human resources. I was like, huh, what? But this is like, it's hot, man. No, you know what I mean? Usually human resources like, oh, snore, but this is hot with this vaccine mandate. And then seeing what they're doing in the States with not just the mandates, like I said, for the employees, but also for the customers, right?
Right.
Yeah. So thanks for coming on. If anything new develops, let us know, because we do know that there were some private sector businesses that have already announced that they're mandating vaccination, like AMC, Dr. Ho Wen's clinic.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially the health service providers.
Right.
That I assume those would be the first to do it.
Right. Yeah.
But like I said, most employers and a lot of the HR managers that I know, their companies, their whole workforce is vaccinated already. So they're announcing the mandatory vaccination, but maybe there's very few people that are going to really be negatively impacted by that.
Right. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, take care.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
Attorney Mike Pangelinan, he's with the Society of Human Resources Managers. They're good talk about vaccine mandating